saw this movie at the library, and I found it interesting enough, so I rented it out. But there's some problems with this movie. And it seems to me the filmmakers were interested mainly in making cheap ideological points than actually trying to understand the complexity of what took place. I think an analytical, analytical, even somewhat condemnatory version of events regarding the United States in the crisis in Southeast Asia is understandable. And I understand that people who generally make documentaries tend to be on the leftist spectrum. Nevertheless, this movie seems to me rather manipulative. I mean, first of all, take the music. It seems to me music in documentaries is a kind of a rather shortcut, a kind of a cheap way to engage our emotions. It doesn't really make us think. It just, in fact, it feels for us. It tells us how to feel. And there's too much of that in this movie. And also how the movie begins with this kind of this image of a pond, and there's golden sunlight. It's almost as if there was this utopia, and the evil American imperialists came and destroyed it. I mean, this is a kind of a hammy and ham-fisted way to, I think, approach history, which is far more complex and which really deserves, I think, more of our intelligence and more of a kind of an inquiring mind. It seems to me the people who made this movie were basically, they were either, they were both trying to be just ideological, propagandistic on the one hand. On the other, they were trying to be very, mushy and compassionate, which is not something that a documentarian ought to wallow in. If that person, he or she, wants to make an intelligent documentary. The movie begins by saying that Americans carried out an illegal war in Laos. But the term illegal, quote unquote illegal, it's very tricky. War like the Vietnam War, where for one thing the North Vietnamese were breaking every rule also. They had no respect for the wishes of the people in the South, nor for the government in the South. The North Vietnamese wanted to unify the country under communism. Now, we can understand why the people in the North wanted to unify a country. Every people want to unify a country. But what Americans were trying to resist or trying to hold back was not the unification of Vietnam, which is something Americans wanted. Americans simply did not want the unification of Vietnam under communism. This was the time of the Cold War. And also, I think our decent and truthful people back then and even now, understand that communism was a great evil. If anything was a great betrayal of mankind, it was communism, which in the 20th century killed tens of millions of people, imprisoned them, and all in the name of liberation and progress and equality. But in reality, communism was a betrayal. It wasn't illegal. It was a criminal enterprise. And the North Vietnamese government was communist. Now, of course, one can argue that in some ways Ho Chi Minh was a very courageous and intelligent figure. He was also a nationalist and a patriot. He sincerely wanted to unify the country. I understand all of that. Nevertheless, he was still a communist, and the kind of system that he wanted to impose on all of Vietnam was something along the lines of Leninism and Stalinism, and possibly even a bit of Maoism. And we know how those things went. And we also know from, other parts of Asia that the countries that came under the influence of the United States did much better politically, eventually democratizing. They did much better economically and socially. They were far more progressive than the communist regimes, which just became backward and corrupt and totalitarian. In fact, if Vietnam and China are doing better today, it's because they have learned from Asian countries which actually turned to the Americans and learned from America politically and economically. it seems to me that even when Americans lost the war in Vietnam militarily, eventually they won the peace because it was obvious that American way and also the way chosen by America's Asian allies was far superior to anything devised by communists, which only led to poverty and in prison camps and the boat people and gulags and mass executions. Now, one can argue that, Americans committed a lot of war crimes, and they did in Indochina. But, like General Sherman said, war is hell. Americans committed war crimes in every war. In fact, I would argue that American war crimes in Korean War or World War II were no less horrendous, or even in the Civil War. When the Northern armies went into the South, they sometimes razed entire towns. War is hell. I mean, we sometimes try to have these rules of engagement. We try to have these, the Geneva Convention. We try to have rules governing the morality of war. But we all know that just the war is hell. Whenever there's war, no matter how humane you try to be, you're shooting people, you're dropping bombs, civilians get killed. That said, I do acknowledge that it was very tragic for the Laotian people because it was a very weak country, wanted to be neutral, but it got caught between the Americans and the North Vietnamese. And it's true that Americans did rather cynically use the Laotians as a kind of a bulwark against North Vietnam. But nevertheless, it must be said, Americans would not have gone into Laos if it weren't for the fact that North Vietnamese were, well, illegally or legally, however you put it, using Laos as a pathway, as a bridge between themselves and South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese were using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which went all the way down, Laos, in order to send troops and military supplies to the south to engage in a war against South Vietnam. Now, I know that there are still a lot of people who tend to see Vietnam War as one of the people who wanted to liberate Vietnam, the communists, and Americans who were, the neo-imperialists, all that nonsense. I mean, looking back now, we should know that to be nonsense. We should know that Americans just wanted to keep communism out of the South. And I think we should also know by now that had South Vietnam been saved by the United States, it would have done much better under American protection. It would probably be a democracy by now. But what happened? The Americans lost, communists took all of Vietnam, and for almost 20 years there was absolute stagnation. It was a complete prison state. There was also the boat people fiasco where over 1 million people died at sea. And in Cambodia, it was a complete disaster when the Khmer Rouge took over. And Laos under communism was just as miserable a place. In fact, Indochina under communism was worse than Indochina under French imperialism. This is not to Russia, to justify French imperialism. It is simply a way to point out the obvious, which is communism is a prison system. It is an ideology that promises one thing and really delivers another. It is an idea that says we have to create a prison state and we have to condition people into robots in order to liberate them, in order to create the new man. Now, it may well be that a lot of people in Vietnam actually adopted communism, not because of the communist theory, but because they found it as the most useful weapon against Western imperialism. And it's understandable why they may have felt that way, considering that the French imperialism had dominated that country for so long. Nevertheless, Americans were not there to dominate those people or to exploit those people. Americans, whether you call them naive or cynical, were there mainly to defend South Vietnam from communism during the Cold War. And I think, in retrospect, the role of America, the role that the Americans played, even though they fought a very dirty war and committed a lot of war crimes, it cannot be said that Americans did it cynically just to dominate other people or to exploit them. This is not a good movie, but if you want to see how history is manipulated by ideologues. It is a good example.